I'm Vinnie Politan. Welcome to Closing Arguments. We are just 5 days away from the start of the Death of George Floyd murder trial, which you will see right here on Court TV. Our cameras inside the courtroom, our microphones inside the courtroom. You'll see and hear all the evidence, all the testimony, the arguments, and it all begins with jury selection, which you will also hear right here on your front row seat to justice. That begins on Monday. But this story began just over 9 months ago. And this is a story that I think can really be summed up by 3 words. And those 3 words had such an impact across our nation, across our system of justice, across the world. And those are the 3 words of George Floyd saying, "I can't breathe." And many of us, most of us, watched that video where that officer's knee is on the neck of George Floyd as he is continuing to say, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." You watch the whole video, you watch George Floyd die. I mean, that's what this story is about. So you look at that video, the way everyone reacted and what was said afterwards, it's all about those 3 words.
Please.
Yeah, across the street, Parks watching.
Please.
2 other people with
Please,
him.
I can't breathe.
Is he breathing right now? Check his
How long
pulse.
we have this conversation?
Check his pulse.
Okay.
The police officer was putting all his might into my brother's neck. He's telling the officer he can't breathe.
The cause of death is what was seen at the time of the death. He couldn't breathe, asphyxia due to compression of the neck and of the back, and that's homicidal.
She wanted to know how he died. And the only thing that I can tell her is he couldn't breathe.
So now, as we're 5 days away from that trial, one of the things that prosecutors have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt is how George Floyd died and how Derek Chauvin caused the death of George Floyd. So you look at all that, you watch the video, and you're thinking to yourself, show the video, someone gets up there and says he couldn't breathe. That's how he died. It's that simple. But it's not going to be that simple at the trial. And that's because of the official determination and opinion of the medical examiner who works for the state and will be a witness for the prosecution. He is not saying that George Floyd died of asphyxiation. So how are they going to prove that Derek Chauvin caused the death? It creates such a problem. Now, in what we just showed you, you heard from Dr. Michael Bond. He's a medical examiner. He believes that's how he died, but he's not the medical examiner in this case. Let's bring in Court TV legal correspondent Julia Janae, who's joining us live from Minneapolis tonight. Let's focus tonight, because I don't think a lot of people realize that when the evidence goes in and they've got to prove the cause of death, they're not going to be arguing asphyxiation. Dr. Baker's the medical examiner. What has he said? What statements, opinions has he made concerning the death of George Floyd?
Well, Dr. Andrew Baker, who is the chief medical examiner of Hennepin County, his testimony is going to be the most critical, but for both sides, because some of the line items in his autopsy report are something that the state will want to highlight, but others the defense will say proves their case. Now, he listed in his autopsy several things, but let's first look at some of the things that he said in his meetings with the state prior to even releasing that autopsy report. He did release it a couple of days after he performed it, which was right after the death of George Floyd on May 26th. And that same day, he sat down with prosecutors. Here's a look at some of the notes that we pulled out from that meeting with those prosecutors, he let them know that at least one of Floyd's arteries was 75% blocked. And he also felt it was important for them to know that he avoided watching any videos while he performed the autopsy. He did not want to let the viral video that was going around that was creating the outrage across the nation, he didn't want that to in any way impact the way that he performed the autopsy. So he did not know exactly what it looked like from the outside. He just focused on the body. The very next day, the prosecutors met with him again. There was a lot going on at that time. There were a lot of answers that were being demanded. So they were meeting with him regularly. And on the next day, May 27th of 2020, he let them know that overexertion of the heart is one of the reasons police departments avoid using this type of hold at issue. So this tells us at this point, he is very aware of what type of restraint, what type of hold was being used on George Floyd. Then we have the autopsy that was released and gave his cause of death and his manner of death. And in that autopsy report, those findings were that this was cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compression. And then the manner of death, that tells us exactly what caused those causes of death or who caused that death. And he listed it as a homicide, saying that the decedent experienced cardiopulmonary arrest while being restrained by law enforcement officers. So we know homicide, when it's listed like that in an autopsy, that's not a legal definition or conclusion, but it's saying that this is not a suicide, this was not natural, this was a killing by another person.
But they're saying heart failure. Dr. Baker saying heart failure. It's not that he could not breathe, it was that his heart failed. And I guess part of what he's saying is that the actions of Chauvin caused that heart failure on the day. So it's not as clean as Dr. Michael Baden's opinion. It's different. It's not asphyxiation. It's heart failure, ultimately.
It does say heart failure, but you see that there are several reasons that are listed, and he leaves room that the state is likely going to be calling other experts to try and fill in what may not be listed and may not be most helpful for them in that autopsy report, because he does say that this is neck compression. So though he doesn't use the words asphyxiation, he does indicate that something regarding the neck, something regarding the restraint, subdual, which is the overpowering by police on George Floyd's body, contributed to the death and is listed in his cause of death and not in just contributing factors lower in that report.
Okay, so I know you have the witness list. I know you've been going through it. Are there any other pathologists on the witness list for prosecutors? Because I'm a former prosecutor. I believe they need a stronger opinion in this case. Do they have other pathologists?
They have other pathologists. They have several that are on the list. Here's a look at 4 that we've identified that are on this list of hundreds. Dr. Joyce Carter, who's a forensic pathologist, and she was also a former armed forces medical examiner, an assistant medical examiner, and Dr. Lindsay Thomas, who's an assistant medical examiner here in Hennepin County. She's retired and is a consultant now, so they're going to have her on the stand. Dr. James Fink is also local to here. He's with Hennepin County Healthcare. And Dr. Paul Uribe, he is with the Dover Air Force Base, and his testimony is going to be likely the most key because he is the director of the Office of Armed Forces. He's the medical examiner there. And they actually performed a review of Dr. Baker's autopsy not too long after Dr. Baker released it because the Department of Justice was reviewing this case. So they had their own medical examiner to review it. And in the report by Dr. Uribe, he lists that they agree with Dr. Baker's findings, and they agree that this was a homicide. But there's a key thing that they put in their report. This is the Armed Forces report, that this case has elements of mechanical and positional asphyxiation. So that's a word that we don't see in Dr. Baker's autopsy, but it is in that Department of Justice review of George Floyd's death.
Crucial, critical, huge. I don't think we can highlight how important that is going to be to prosecutors. Thank you for clearing that up. All right, let's look on the other side of the coin, right? Because it's a trial, there are two sides. Prosecution has the burden, but the defense has an opportunity to bring their own experts forward. You went through their witness list. What did you find?
They have several pathologists on their list as well, but here's the top one, the primary examiner that they are going to be calling, Dr. David Fowler. He is going to be their top expert that Eric Nelson, representing Derek Chauvin, is going to be calling. And he has been the chief medical examiner for the state of Maryland for 17 years, 2002 to 2019. So a long list of accomplishments, grants, presentations in his CV. And though we don't have a report from Dr. Fowler, nothing that's been released to the public, we do know that they are going to be highlighting the contributing factors that were in the autopsy report from Dr. Baker. That includes things like the cardiopulmonary arrest, the issues that George Floyd had with his heart, the hypertensive heart disease, and also the fentanyl intoxication and recent methamphetamine use. This is from Dr. Baker's autopsy, but we know it's something that the defense is going to be highlighting and saying that this is actually the cause of death. There are a couple of other things that are listed in the autopsy report that the defense has already pulled out in their findings, and that includes that the medical examiner found that George Floyd had a sickled appearing cells. So think of sickle cell anemia, that trait. But this determination by Dr. Baker, he finds that there's no way to prove that the cells were sickled before George Floyd died, that it's possible for cells to sickle after someone's death. But it's something that the defense will likely still be throwing into their group of problems with the state's case. Also, COVID-19 there at the bottom of your screen was something that George Floyd tested positive for, and he let officers know that he had just gotten over COVID-19 while he was being arrested.
Yeah, I think that's going to play large, COVID. I mean, we've been living in that world for the last year. I can't imagine that the defense would not try to jump on that as well. You mentioned the fentanyl, and I'm not sure which attorney filed the papers on this with the video, but I want to show everyone a video that we've highlighted a little white spot on George Floyd's tongue when he's first approached. Let's show it to everyone first, and then I've got a couple questions for you. Let's roll that.
Damn, man.
Stay in the car. Let me see your other hand.
I'm sorry.
Let me see your other hand.
Please, Ms. Officer.
Both hands.
Do nothing.
Put your hands up right now. Let me see your other hand.
All right. What I do, though? What do we do? Ms. Officer?
Put your hand up there. Put your hand up.
All right, Julia, I know you can see this as well. As we watch George Floyd here, there's a moment when his mouth is open where there's a little white spot. Now, I have no idea what it is. My question to you is, do we expect Chauvin's attorneys to perhaps argue that this little white spot in George Floyd's mouth was the fentanyl, that he ingested it as soon as he was approached by police?
We do expect him to suggest it. It's difficult to prove one way or the other, but for reasonable doubt, we know that that's something that he would want to bring up and bring out. We've seen it in the filings. I think it was initially brought out and the video was attached to a filing by Earl Gray, who represents Thomas Lane, one of the other officers who's been charged with aiding and abetting. But we expect that the defense for Derek Chauvin will also be bringing that to the table before these jurors, because the fentanyl intoxication is what they are going to be saying is the cause of death in this case, and not the officer involved restraint.
All right, now we've got to bring this all together here because it's a court of law, legal standards. The jury has to apply the legal standards that the judge will give them. What is the legal standard for causation here? Because we've got so many potential things impacting George Floyd. If the jury thinks that, well, it was the neck restraint, but also maybe some partly COVID and partly this and partly that, what's the legal standard for causation?
What these jurors are going to have to determine, because there's no getting around these contributing factors and these natural causes that were also playing a role, but they'll have to determine whether or not those other factors are a superseding cause or an intervening cause. And looking at how the state wants to tell this jury what the definition of superseding cause is. And this first part is actually what both sides agree that a superseding cause is. It's a cause that comes after the defendant's act. So in this case, the police restraint, and that this cause alters the natural sequence of events and produces a result that would not have otherwise occurred. In addition, the state says that an action that occurs before the defendant's conduct is not the sole cause of the death does not constitute a superseding cause. So when we're talking about whether or not the presence of drugs or the heart failure, if it's a superseding cause or not, the state is saying it has to be something that happened after the police restraint, and that it has to be something that alters what was already going to happen. So of course they're going to argue that yes, this was a contributing factor. Yes, this may have caused his death to come quicker, but it did not change the chain of events that had already started when those officers had him pinned to the ground.
All right, and how about the defense? Do they have a differing view of this, or is this what we believe the jury will end up having to, base their verdict on trying to figure out what a superseding cause is here?
Well, the defense agrees that that is the overall definition of a superseding cause, that it's something that comes in and alters the natural chain of events. But they also point out in their proposed jury instructions that they submitted to the court that the defendant is not criminally liable if a superseding cause caused the death. And they go on to say that an overdose or heart failure that causes a death is a superseding, intervening cause. So they believe that those contributing factors in this case do constitute something that alters the natural chain of events. So it's going to be up to these jurors and the judge on which of those instructions is going to go before this jury as to whether or not the heart failure and the other factors are something that completely keep Derek Chauvin from being guilty, or whether he is acquitted.
It is extremely nuanced. It is very subtle, but it's extremely important. I mean, the whole trial could come down to that, what you just explained to us. That could be what makes the difference between guilty and not guilty. Unbelievable, but you see the video, and then you get into the law, and you get into the experts, and it becomes a lot more complicated. But well done, Julia. Really appreciate that.